Sword of Heaven and Earth, henceforth referred to as SoHaE, or... deja vu, let's try something else. You might be familiar with this image. Oop, that's illegible, let's cut to the important part. You'll have to take my word for it, but it's coincidence that I've covered the 3 must-play ROM hacks. Sword of Heaven and Earth was the most interesting option I had. There are a lot of firsts with SoHaE. First Japanese ROM hack I've covered, though not the first I've played. The first ROM hack I would record my first playthrough for, the first ROM hack I would try a proper review format for, and the first ROM hack I've covered that tells its own unique story while still staying within the rules and lore of an established setting. Now, I'll get some technical nitpicks out the way first. The game's translation is passable. Supposedly it's a machine translation that's been touched up here and there, but you're expecting some odd grammar, so you're gonna see it. The most common and consistent example is the phrase, "the Burns Army." The odd grammar is eyebrow-raising at worst, though there was at least one time where Lady Lyn was called a he, and also they swapped the vowel sound letters in her name. Another technical nitpick that may not be reproducible was some sound issues, the cause of which I'm not entirely certain on. For my previous 2 ROM hack videos I used Visual Boy Advance. I've been using it for close to 2 decades and have almost never had an issue with it. For SoHaE I used MGBA. I can't put my finger on it, but the visuals seem a bit more buttery smooth. However, it's possible MGBA was the cause of these sound issues. With further testing, tabbing in and out seems like the primary cause. A quick closing and reopening of the emulator would fix it, soft resetting usually would not. The hack also has a feature where portraits blink, and one of the recurring boss portrait blink frames are bugged. There are no support conversations in the game, and I'm unaware if they exist somewhere even in an untranslated state, and occasionally there is some untranslated Japanese text, things like affinities, thief steal text, the tactician star rating screen, but everything important is translated. There is also a handy little resource in the form of a unit recruitment guide and growth list. I tried not to check the growth list until I was well into the game, and I even didn't check the recruitment list until around chapter 5 or 6. Though once I did start checking it, I would be constantly referring to it and even decided to use one unit because of it. So, format for this video is closer to a review. I'm thinking I'll cover plot, presentation, gameplay, have a spoiler section for story, and then conclude. I'll be honest, I don't think I'm that big of a fan of the Leeb. I've only played FE7 and consider it mediocre to average, though it has been several years since I last played it. I've also never played FE6, all impressions of that game lead me to believe I would not enjoy it at all. The last GBA game is Sacred Stones, which, yeah, I could see in my top 5 favourite actual Fire Emblem games, at 5th place probably. Despite my seeming lack of fondness for GBA Fire Emblem, I am actually quite fond of it. See previous 5 hours worth of me and GBA FE content in the form of ROMHack videos. All that having been said, SoHaE is another FE7 hack, sticking within the rules of FE7, and it's a pretty good one at that, making full use of what makes GBA Emblem fun. From what I'd heard about SoHaE, I was under the impression it was an interquel between FE6 and FE7. That's not 100% accurate. To my understanding, the start of the game is the backstory of FE6. Throughout the story, Seiya, with the help of Aryll, our not-Molinas, has to navigate Sasaean tribal infighting, the civil war in Ilia, the burned Black Fang Dragon unit clan Tokusentai, a mysterious new force called the Ninas, and Lycian political backstabbery. Pretty sure Etruria does sweet fuck all in the story. Not particularly helped by the awkward translation and lack of supports, but I never really felt any strong character moments were present in the story outside of Seiya and Aryll, and even then a lot of them are gimmies. There's also a fair few semi-needless cameos.
Do you remember
Fire Emblem?
Gotta give it up for
Fire Emblem.
I do remember
Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem.
But I remember him. I remember his costume.
Look, such things are at worst eye-rolling. I can't imagine anyone actually getting upset at them. I'll try to avoid spoilers for when I talk about the story, which is different to plot, just trust me. Suffice to say, SoHaE is a near-continent spanning hop through familiar territory, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's enough that's original that still fits established Leeb lore if you care about that, and by the end of the game, events are directly coinciding with FE6. That bloke from Smash Bros even shows up to say hello. Not too much more I can say without spoiling story details, so let's get to the meat and potatoes, with a quick detour to... By quick I mean about a paragraph. It's GBA Fire Emblem, no bells or whistles. I think SoHaE has a new sprite, which is just Lyn's sprite without a ponytail. I like that portraits have blinking now. It's a little thing, but it's nice. Speaking of portraits, most if not all of the effort into new visuals seems to have gone here, with mostly good results. I can of course make fun of some of them, and I'm going to.
Vision like a praying mantis, this bug-eyed fuck. Look at him, well done.
And stop staring at me with them big old eyes!
Why is Baraku a boss? Rip in peace, Helmet-san. Actually, that's fucking dope. As for the music, I heard some new tracks because I haven't played FE6, but I could definitely place them as from FE6. Honestly, that was enough for a lot of the game to feel refreshingly new and exciting. The GBA Emblem games have some of the most crisp, colourful and striking visuals in the series, and this ROMHack correctly intuits that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Other ROMHacks can struggle with this basic concept.
If it ain't broke, we'll break it.
Before we get into looking at SoHaE's gameplay, we'll have to quickly look at Fire Emblem gameplay down to its absolute foundation. Click on dude, move dude, and attack enemy dude. This foundation is built upon by two major elements, maps and units. Maps should have well thought out terrain, a good pace, unique objectives, interesting obstacles, things like that which I've talked about before. From there you place units you control, and enemy units. Units should have various strengths and weaknesses, and enemy units should be arranged in such a way that a player can feel very intelligent by using their unit's strengths against the enemy unit's weaknesses. All this can honestly be somewhat difficult to consistently execute for an entire game, and while SoHaE flounders in places, overall it brings new and interesting things to a majority of its maps. The maps and units are then influenced by mechanics which typically differ significantly from game to game. For example, Shadow Dragon in the subtitle has vastly different mechanics and plays very differently to Shadow Dragon despite having the same foundation and same maps. To me, GBA Emblem represents the perfect balance of keeping close to Fire Emblem's foundation while still having just enough modern features that allow interesting tactics and fun options. Unique to GBA and thus present in SoHaE are Convoy as a unit, Rescue in its entirety, Con for weapon weight, battle calculations strictly as they come, and my favourite, the ability for thieves to light up the night like the fucking Proto-Men. Now, maps are a much more important factor to look at, but I'm not really going to go in detail, just point out some of the more neat gimmicks that make up the identity for certain chapters. I've also thrown in some unit analysis in another video, so I'll try to keep redundant material to a minimum. The first standout map was 4X. Previous experience with guide and chapters and ROMHacks is overall a positive one, and that continued in SoHaE. The map itself is solid, simple, but because I like it when a ROMHack does something I haven't seen before, I was quite happy to see red convoys. In the story, the journey is just starting, and SoHaE needs supplies, so when the opportunity arises to raid a burned convoy, Aryll suggests she takes it, even if it is similar enough to banditry that SoHaE has to redouble her convictions in the face of her actions. It also marked the first point in which there was a real threat of death, avoided by a fortunate dice roll. Is it a good idea to have an optional guidance chapter mark the exit of early game handholding? I think so. Chapter 9 has you work through a few lanes that offer both obstruction and cover. It's less the map that's interesting and more the reinforcements. That SoHaE throws 20 speed Pegasus Knights at you so early shows that it is willing to bend the rules in the name of providing a unique but still fair challenge. Good stuff. Chapter 17 is a thrilling one. You finally get a reminder that Alib is at war and Byrne is moving its pieces across the board, attacking the Lycian League who SoHaE is seeking aid from, and throwing everything into chaos. Zephiel himself leads the attack on Foray with the best reference to the joint nature of SoHaE as in between FE6 and FE7. Elowood is there too, but he may as well not be. The map pushes you to make a daring gambit to secure the top village, only to immediately punish you for doing so, though not without recourse. Operation Save MVP went quite well for me. Almost immediately following is Chapter 18, which will look very familiar to any FE7 fan. Of course, it plays rather differently to the FE7 version. For one, there's no fog, thank fuck for that. The map is very static, featuring almost no reinforcements I can recall, and a boss trifecta that springs a nasty trap. Now, I've been playing Fire Emblem long enough that caution is an old friend, but so too are really stupid mistakes. In the back of my mind, I felt something very wrong as I approached the boss. Where the fuck's my restore staff? I think I'd forget my ass if it wasn't attached at the hip, but it may speak to the excellence of design that this blunder turned into a very interesting, exciting engagement from the moving flyer boss. Chapter 22 was a delight to play even if it did not initially seem so, with the objective to stop the enemy formations that really do completely ignore you and go for the end zone. It was a great map to showcase what I think is an appeal of Fire Emblem, your elite army taking on a force with greater numbers but individually weaker and with less or no strategy. I can pretty confidently say that SoHaE's maps are all designed to work a specific idea. Either the map came first and the idea was sprinkled on, or the idea formed the map around it. Even a simple idea of hold the enemy off in a series of choke points is good enough to build a map around. Most of these ideas work excellently, and I can't think of a SoHaE map that doesn't achieve what I would perceive to be its goal of flow and execution, although that's only on an individual level. I do think SoHaE has some pacing issues which I'll mention more with story. I didn't enjoy every map, fuck Chapter 20 and its dumb civilians, but I can't remember any map that I would consider bad or lacking direction. Some of them definitely drag on, and there were one or two instances where there were turns of nothing or almost nothing, which is odd because I don't consider myself a fast player, but there I was, on Chapter 20 funnily enough, thumb up my ass and slack-jawed, waiting for the enemy to show up. It's just a lack of refinement, and I don't mind too much when a hack is lacking such a thing in non-consequential places. I can simultaneously move on to some unit gripes while also wrapping up maps by talking about Chapter 26. First, it's a great idea to have us fight evil versions of the FE7 lords, and starting off with evil Hector was a great idea. Did you know Hector becomes an army unit on promotion? It does absolutely nothing for him, except make him weak to effective weapons, which with just 2 times effectiveness, does absolutely nothing. So because you fight evil Lyn last, the bosses get harder as the map goes on. The map does not get harder as it goes on, save the final room, which is to be expected, and here comes the gripe. We'll use Chapter 20 as a benchmark for when your entire army has promoted. At no point from then onwards does the game consistently start using promoted enemies, save the very final chapter. The problem is not that these unpromoted enemies are still strong enough to match your units, it's that they grant pitiful experience. In the penultimate chapter, the game is still throwing unpromoted enemies at you and they are not even a threat. I don't have many problems with how SoHaE uses its units, both the players and the enemies, but the problems I do have are significant. Fighting unpromoted enemies is not satisfying even if they can match your promoted units. One of your units finally levels up after killing a dozen enemies, and they get plus HP only. It's enough to make me want to stop playing. The other problem is con, which I mentioned briefly in my unit review. It really does needlessly make a unit worse, and it affects your units far more than the enemies. Minor unit gripes come down to an abundance of mixed range formations which all but require excessive use of javelins and hand axes, turning parts of SoHaE into what people incorrectly criticise FE7 for being. The entire cast having single-digit resistance doesn't mean engaging magical foes requires more care or thought, it just means you move in with a mend rather than just a heal after the battle, and baiting them out is much deadlier, but only because of a weakness you can only mitigate with a barrier effect. Last thing I can think of is the Ninas all having 0 luck is the most interesting difference between all the factions you fight, but it's more of a quirk than anything significant. Again, this comes back to the vast majority of enemies being unpromoted. Yes, Saiyan forces will typically throw Bonites at you, while Burn will throw Wyverns at you, but the way these factions are interspersed, they still feel like a conglomerate blob of red. However, SoHaE does offer a diverse cast, covering every single available class, plus a couple extra, and even some pre-promote replacements if you're inclined towards Iron Manning. I've already covered the early game cast being designed in such a way that the disparity between their stats leads to either an actual choice to be made, or significant difference in use case for the different units. Yes, you will likely end up with a standard squad featuring the Lord, Paladins, Flyers, Healers, Strong Infantry and a Mage of some sort, but that's not a bad thing, especially when SoHaE makes no move to innovate away from FE6 and FE7 class structure. Still trying not to get into spoilers, the story's pacing and structure is adequate. Fire Emblem story should be a continual progression forwards and upwards, building more and more to a grand finale. SoHaE misses the mark a little bit. It's around, I'd say, mid-game where the momentum just sort of halts. You find yourself at a ceasefire of the civil wars in SoHaE and Ilia, the middle of Byrne's conquest of Alib, Etruria's whatever the fuck Etruria is doing, nothing, and the Lycian League is approaching as an afterthought. There's a few chapters where it almost feels you play a map for the sake of it. It didn't help that because of my stubborn insistence on promoting at 20 as well as SoHaE hitting level 20, it culminated in a bit of a block. All that is to say, it's not a deal breaker, just something you may have to bear and soldier on even if there's a far too long calm before any approaching storm. The story is almost entirely focused on SoHaE, Aryll and Lindis, with the recurring villains, the Black Dragon Unit and Ninaz, mostly just impeding these three from reuniting, which is the driving drama of the game. Yes, Alib has been engulfed in war, but whenever these groups are involved, it can be easy to forget that. SoHaE also has to deal with opposing Sasaean tribes, but I really didn't care, maybe because they kept throwing out different tribe names like Kotola and Arslan, and it just doesn't mean anything to me. Hell, I had to start editing and read Lyn and SoHaE's tribe name in-game to remember it. All I could think of was that they're heirs to House Kaelin of the Lycian League, and to that end I don't even know what happened to Kaelin. Assimilated into a united Lycia led by Foray? Like I said at the top, I just don't find Alib very interesting. Too many working parts, maybe. SoHaE sets up intrigue rather early and rather well, and it's appropriate we don't see much of FE6's big players like Nash and Murdoch or Big Zeph himself because they're off busy with FE6. The villains are adequately memorable, except Loki. Gelling is a right evil bastard, Sass as the Camus works well, and leaders of the Ninaz have this interesting thing about familial bonds and finding purpose that, while interesting, isn't executed as well as Delatmol. Overall, the story is competently told, minus the grammatical errors present as a result of the machine translation, but it's all rather easy to follow and recall. Aryll is interesting to listen to by proxy through SoHaE, and SoHaE herself has a good, if typical, Fire Emblem Lord arc. I want to talk about some of the more important and emotional moments in the game and how they're executed now, so if you haven't played SoHaE yourself or you want to avoid spoilers for whatever reason, go to here. So the driving force of the narrative is Lyn's daughter wanting to find Lyn. Lyn has been taken by the Ninaz, remnants of Nurgle's morphs, as revenge for her part in killing their creator. We'll get more into that relationship later, but as SoHaE needs help on her quest, she seeks out Reno, the most meaningful FE7 member berry. There's some voodoo bullshit with Lindis acting as a beacon for the Ninaz that's inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but most of this comes to a head in chapter 19. Now, ignoring the rather amusing fact that a level 20 Lyn has 15 strength, this chapter is the first time in the game I remember feeling an emotion, and it's an absolute gimme. A mother and daughter reuniting after pain and suffering, even coming to physical blows, is something you'd have to try to fuck up the emotional weight of. I'm not saying it's bad, and in fact it's in direct contrast to most other FE moments involving parents, in that this is the saving of the parent's life rather than the parents giving the life for their child. SoHaE and Lyn's moment is bittersweet and hopeful as opposed to Albert or Grail's death, which is overwhelmingly melancholy, full of grief and sadness. I don't know how intentional this is. Yes, it would be awful if Lyn was lost to SoHaE forever, and the story could have gone that way. It's not like Lyn is in FE6 in any capacity, but because I would say this hack is much more about FE7 than FE6, because she lives, she gets to meet Illowwood again, and mourn the passing of Hector together, which is the only other story moment that got me feeling things. Anyway, Renault is a rather important pillar of the story. He of course recognises Lyn, though there isn't much done with this. Ultimately, after SoHaE and friends realise they've been taken on a ruse cruise by Xenon, leader of the Morphs, he puts his entire life force into the same Great Warp spell that I don't remember Athos casting. And he passes, lamenting how good it was to finally have had friends. This is good. Again, I don't remember much context about FE7, but wasn't he once Nurgle's friend before Quintessence and Power drove him mad, driving Renault into reclusion and isolation on the Dread Isle? I'm not sure what sort of central theme is here. It's partially obscured by it all being a reference, but there is something here. I'm very confident that the final chapters working the exact same way as FE7 is intentional. Gather up the powerful weapons, take on a Dark Druid before fighting the Fire Dragon. When you get to the Fire Dragon, which is more of some sort of Shadow Dragon, not these ones, the game finally deigns to play Dragon's Gate 2. I always feel a swell of determination and strength when I hear Dragon's Gate 2. It's a phenomenal track, easily one of the best final map themes in Fire Emblem. Incredibly high praise because it's competing with A Grasping Truth, Twilight of the Gods, God-Shattering Star, Funeral of Flowers, and Forbidden Sanctuary. Apex of the world, go home. In between all of this is the SoHaE tribal drama, which I really didn't find interesting, save when it involved Sass, and only when Saya moved from internal conflict and hesitation to absolute resolution in the idea that if she must, she will kill her friend. SoHaE has so few major characters, so Saya should stand out as memorable or compelling, and unfortunately I think she only does by default. Saya's arc is very standard, starting unsure, lacking in skill and confidence, not truly understanding the stakes behind the machinations of her enemies before growing and standing proud, willing to do what it takes, surpassing those who came before her in the name of peace for her people. When she struggles, she has her dearest comrades and family to help. There's not much more I can do except summarise the story. To me, it's operating on that basic of a level, which there's nothing wrong with. The moment-to-moment story that I found compelling mostly comes through Aryll and his guidance of Saya, and this is written a bit better. Aryll wants success. It is his duty to safeguard Saya, but he's not a warrior, so he must use his wits and experience. Great stuff. Saya never ignores Aryll. She never makes a stupid decision in direct opposition to Aryll's advice that I remember, and in fact there are a few times where after talking with Aryll, Saya's resolve strengthens, either to do something against her moral code, or to truly see the evils of the day through for a better future. Lastly, there's this spitefulness to the Morphs that bleeds through Lyn into Saya. The Morphs had no purpose after Nurgle was killed, but they found it in wanting to destroy Lyn. Hector and Nilo would too, but they're less important to this story. The Morphs also found purpose in each other. Xenon pulled the Morphs together, manipulating this desire for purpose and family. I'm probably reading too much into it again, but Saya goes on her journey for very similar purposes. Not every story needs a central theme, but is that SoHaE's purpose? We'd have Tak with Triumph, Delatmol with Potential, and now SoHaE with Purpose. Off the top of my head, TLPs might be Dedication or Loyalty, but again, I'm not a writer. I wasn't a writer for these projects, so my head's up my own arse trying to describe these meanings. I'm looking back on all these aspects in the grand scheme after having beaten the game of course, but to sum up, there's little to criticise in the story, except maybe all the references, and there's only a little to praise. As I keep saying, this isn't a bad thing. After all, Fire Emblem is all about gameplay, right? Wrong, but what's here, with its faults, is just fine. I recommend SoHaE. The deserved bronze medal of ROMHacks I've played, and that is a compliment. Like all other ROMHacks and FE games proper, there are flaws, but overall the full package is competent at the bare minimum. I don't believe SoHaE compares to Delatmol or Tak for quality or enjoyment, but it beats TLP and every single FE8 hack I've played. There are some pacing and unit quality issues, some maps have irritating enemy unit formations or gimmicks, and the poor XP gain thanks to unpromoted enemies can lead to very unsatisfying moment-to-moment gameplay. I'd say my criticisms end there, beyond anything I could criticise GBA Emblem as a whole on, which doesn't seem fair. The variety of maps, interest in new things, and simplicity of design, while not straying outside of expectations set by primarily FE7 more than FE6, lends itself to a neat little experience that I could recommend as a first ROMHack experience, though maybe not over others, and depending on what exactly you're wanting out of a ROMHack.